And welcome to Co-op Guild. This is Steve. I'm here with two special guests today. This is a chat I've been waiting for a long time. So we've got Emil, who's designer of Rogue
Hey,
Angels. How's it going, Emil?
hi. Good, good. Thank you, and thank you for having me on.
Awesome. And we also have Tyson, designer of Phantom Epoch. How's it going, Tyson?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Oh, great. So yeah, it's just probably gonna be the three of us today, but this is your first time joining. Welcome. This is our co-op chat, which is a live chat we try to do weekly, but you know, schedules everything get in the way, of course. But where we talk about various board game topics, generally the cooperative focus. But this one I've been looking forward to because I want to talk more about some of the design elements and what get the behind the scenes look, as we've got two designers on the chat with us. So before we jump into that, I just want to say hi to everyone in the chat. I see lots of friends here. Got Elaine here, Mike's here. Let's see, who else we got? I saw others in here too. Sorry. Oh, Kim's here. Hi, Kim. Chris. Sweet. Awesome. I'm sure other people will be joining soon. Cool. Okay. So, oh, hey, Brian. How's it going? No designer, David. Welcome, David. Pumped for both of these games. Yes. They are both, yeah, as I said, the Rogue Angels and Phantom Epoch have been fortunate to have played both of them. They are both awesome games. Really, really fun stuff there. So, okay, let's jump into it. So we are here to do this chat. I kind of want to make this a recurring thing, so we might try to do this once a month or something, depending on schedules or who knows what. Try to get these guys on, maybe some other designers on at the same time to dive into some of these topics. So, but today I figure we'll talk about like the work process for designing campaign games, because both Emil and Tyson have done this with their titles, which haven't released yet, right? So, but yeah, can you late back you guys' games still? Is that still a thing?
Yep. Yep.
What about you, Emil? Is Rogue
Mm,
Games
yeah,
able to relate back? Yep.
yeah,
Cool.
that is still available. Yeah.
There you go. So awesome. Okay. So let us start jumping into it. So let's start with you, Emil. Let's give a quick synopsis of Rogue Angels and maybe focus a little bit on the campaign nature of it.
Yeah, yeah. For those who haven't heard about Rogue Angels, I'm sure a lot of your audience have have already heard about it. But it's a science fiction crawler with a legacy campaign element to it, and it takes what I found the most interesting about stories like Mass Effect and condense it into an accessible board game experience. So it borderlines between a role playing game and a board game, and tries to navigate it in a way that shouldn't consume people completely, other than hopefully getting back because the story is great. So yeah, it's taking players on an adventure where you start out as mercenaries and you slowly get involved in all kind of conflicts, and of course the major battle between good and evil.
Yeah, so I know Brian asked the question here, asking for overview, what type of campaign games they are. So your campaign game would be maybe like a branching
It would
narrative
be close
with.
to, yeah, choose your own story
Mhm.
kind of thing. So you it's a dance between a story where you have a lot of choices and elements of consequences, and then a skirmish dungeon crawl element, and those things keep intertwining, and that's how you play out the story whenever there's something action orientated going on.
Awesome. And Tyson, you've done Phantom Epoch, with it also has a campaign structure, but actually it's a little bit different, I would say, in the structure. We want to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I'll preface it by saying I hate giving the elevator pitch because I never know what to focus on. But I was just watching Emil and thinking, what can I take from that elevator pitch? No, it's a 1 to 4 player campaign game. It blends both fantasy and sci-fi themes. At the start of the campaign, you create your character by choosing a species and a class separately, And those together kind of determine your starting attributes, your actions, and then as with any campaign game, as you progress through it, you're getting new weapons, you're getting new equipment, upgrading stuff, getting new skills. In the case of Phantom Epoch, you're also upgrading the starship that serves as your headquarters, and that unlocks different features that, without getting into spoilers, that kind of aid you on the missions that you go on. And then you reach a point where eventually your starting class branches into one of two different unique advanced classes. Yeah.
And then I think one thing that is a little bit different for your campaign structure for Phantom Epoch is you've got different worlds to travel to, I guess you would say. So you can kind of choose where you want to go next, as opposed to a branching one like in Rogue Angels, right? So a little bit that might be one of the differences in the campaign structures between these two games.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of both there.
Mm-hmm.
The story does branch out, but there's three main planets that you're going to visit throughout the campaign of Phantom Epoch, and you hop back and forth between them as you want to.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's different equipment and stuff available on each planet too. So you might want to go shopping on one planet by doing a mission there, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Ryan asks, is Rogue Angels a balance between story decisions and scenario based dungeon? Then is that accurate description, Emil?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I would say, like this, the story is the main focus. It has an arc. It has a purpose, and it drives characters and players from one end to the other. And it depends a lot on how you approach, like what you choose to do when you are dungeon crawling, so to speak, when you're playing, when you're playing on the different maps, and the consequences and choices therein will lead you in different directions, and then every now and then you will have different choices of where to go next and what to follow up on, what missions you want to partake in, because there are different in my game it's called missions and not like dungeons, so to speak, but it's the same concept, right? But it has an overarching story, so I wouldn't say it's like you just choose whatever you want to do. It's not explorative in that sense because it has a story to tell.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'll start with you, Tyson. The next question I'm gonna dive into. But what made you want to create a campaign game versus like a standalone game?
Yeah. So taking a step back from that, I knew that I wanted to create a campaign game before I knew that I wanted to create a board game. And so I've always been a sucker for role-playing games of any sort, from JRPGs to pen and paper and board games as well, of course. I I like to, and since I was a kid, I've liked to create new worlds and stories within those worlds. And games in general have always been my favorite medium for telling a story because it lets people actually interact with that story. So I didn't always know that I wanted to create a campaign board game, but I've wanted to create a campaign game for a very long time.
Were you exploring other mediums like video games by chance? Is that what you're trying to imply with that, or?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I would play around with things like RPG Maker and create games in there. Yeah, so I thought about a video game as well before finally settling on a board game.
Yeah, Emil, and I know you've created this elaborate campaign structure for Rogue Angels. What made you want to go that route? And I know if anyone's familiar with it, but there's this quite large branching campaign tree that drives Rogue Angels structure.
Yeah, and maybe it was some part of me that wanted to punish me for something I've done before. uh, no, it's actually it's very obvious in point in time when I got kind of obsessed with this idea, because I was playing Mass Effect 2, and you have something called the suicide mission, and some people have of course heard of that, a lot of people, but the whole thing was that in the end, there's a point where Commander Shepard jumps towards the ship. And the whole point leading up to that is an in-game cutscene. That means not pre-rendered and therefore not necessarily defined. And the thing is, a lot of the things that happen in the hour up to that jump is not defined, but is defined early on by different choices you've done. So the climax there really got to me as like, this is how storytelling should be if you want to surprise people, and you do not have you have an interactive media and not a movie per se, right? So, and I got obsessed with this idea that if I could put this onto a board game where the limitations is that readers, you read at a certain speed, you can look ahead, you have a long climb, so you cannot surprise people in the same way, but you have to get as close as possible. And that's where I kind of got this idea that my goal should be to make people cry. I mean, that's not necessarily possible, but that's the goal. So what do I need to do in order to get through those steps? And there's only a campaign game that could kind of create that scenario, right? Because I wanted something of a build-up with high stakes and with choices where you could look back at your choices and kind of see where you have done things or where you could have done differently, or you could contemplate on what you have been doing, right? So yeah, that was my initial idea.
Yeah, that's something that I was curious about when it comes to going about creating these campaign games. How often do, from a designer's standpoint, you go into it saying, I know I want this to be a campaign game, versus starting out with a game concept that you want to create, and then maybe during the process you switch it from campaign to like a standalone back to a campaign. Um, and how what are the ramifications for doing that? But for here, it sounds like you both knew you wanted a campaign game. Did you ever consider at some point in the process that maybe it could be switched to standalone, or maybe you want to add a standalone aspect to it?
So for me, this is going to be a little bit at odds with my last answer, because Phantom Epoch, I started it out not necessarily as a campaign game. The original idea was simply for it to be a framework for my own gaming groups to be able to build scenarios and campaigns within. And what ended up being Phantom Epoch is kind of the first campaign built within that framework. And in a lot of ways, that's still what it is. There's no reason, and I would absolutely love if players who get their hands on Phantom Epoch decide to build their own scenarios and own campaigns within the framework, and there's absolutely nothing preventing them from doing so. So that's kind of what I started out with, and then eventually that did become the campaign game that I always knew I wanted to make.
Yeah, I think it was a campaign game from the very get-go here. There was no way to achieve that in any other way, because if you shorten it down to a, let's say, 2-hour play session, then you're not talking about particularly memorable choices, or then you can have a shock value, but you can only do that one time. So I needed more time in order to explore and for people to explore the story and the consequences of choices they make.
Yeah, you mentioned the shock value of that and that's an interesting point I hadn't quite considered. Is that one of the values that drives people towards these campaign games, having that um, association with, or that connection with the game, building that time over multiple play sessions to learn the characters, learn the environment, whatever, to have the greatest impact, to have these shock moments in that. I'm sure the chat can jump in here too. What drives them to campaign games? But is that kind of what you're getting at here, Emil? Is like that is a good source for trying to get that end result?
I think so. If you respect people's time or players' time, and you acknowledge how clever people are, and build on those assumptions, then I think you will create a good payoff and something that resonates with people. And just like stories, you should be comfortable with stories ending. You should also be comfortable with stories having something to tell, and not everything can be, the Marvel movie thing where you're like going from one epic fight to another, just as an example, right? But there, there can be build up. Like if you go back and watch Back to the Future or something, and every scene and every dialogue in that movie has a payoff at some point.
Yeah.
Like, and even though it's slow, at some point everything has a payoff, which means that it's such a good experience, right?
So I'm gonna throw a monkey wrench in this a little bit because we've been talking a lot about like the narrative elements of it. What are your thoughts on a campaign game that has light or no narrative elements in it, and it just focuses on the progression of characters or something else in the game, right? Could that what do you think are the pros and cons of approaching a game in that manner?
I think it becomes more of an engine building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those definitely has a place. I would say Diablo is a looter, right? it's
Right.
it's a game about continuously getting new stuff, and that is the whole premise of the game. So there's a place for that, for sure. um, I think in a board game it's a bit harder to do because of the physical limitations of a game. So there are some limitations there that makes it difficult to execute in the same random manner and keep progressing like that, right? But I think that it definitely has a viable place, and can be done. I'm not particularly thrilled about sitting down and just playing through for engine building in
Mm-hmm.
general. So,
Mm-hmm.
but sure.
What about you, Tyson? What are your thoughts on the difference between a campaign with a strong narrative or heavy narrative versus a light or no narrative?
Yeah, I think I feel pretty similarly to Emil for the most part. It definitely, it everybody wants different things out of a game. For me personally, one of the things that keeps me getting a game back to the table, and a campaign game in particular, is an attachment to my character or characters. And without that strong narrative, that attachment doesn't exist so much. Um, Rather, actually influencing a world by my actions and influencing my character by my actions. Seeing that progression is super important to me to keep getting a game back to the table. But
Makes sense.
I would say that's just me personally, not necessarily an overall view of whether that's possible or not.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yep. Do you see a question in the chat from another designer, actually, Brian? He's got a few games on his belt too, but he has asked a question. How does each game handle failure? How do you decide how to handle mission to failure? Fail forward consequences, or is your game a repeat the mission style? What made you make this choice? So, Tyson, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. So, strictly speaking, it's a repeat the mission thing, but every time you play a mission, successful or failed, you have an opportunity to power up. And I won't throw any game under the bus, but just recently I was playing a campaign game where you got more powerful every time you succeeded, but you got weaker every time you failed. And it ended up like, if you were continually struggling with a particular scenario, you were just bashing your head against the wall, and it was getting harder and harder each time. Whereas with Phantom Epoch, yeah, the idea is you replay a mission if you fail it, but you're getting more powerful each attempt. So you're still growing your characters, you're still getting new abilities, new equipment, and whatnot. so that the next attempt at it, you can vary your strategy more and be a bit more powerful going into it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I know games can run into that a snowball effect, right? Where like you just get more and more powerful, you start steamrolling at the end, right? Um, and it's interesting because I wonder if that approach of trying to be successful in a given mission or a scenario, wherever it happens to be, the desires to add a better reward to have the incentive to be successful. But is the incentive to just be victorious enough, right? As opposed to doing something on top of that. I guess that's kind of what you're suggesting, Tyson, right?
Yeah, so I mean, like in Phantom Epoch, as you're completing missions, you're still getting power-ups for completing a mission that you wouldn't get for failing it, but those are with view of the next mission, like to keep up with the next mission's difficulty.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're struggling with a mission, um, you don't just have to keep bashing your head against the wall. Going in with the exact same actions, equipment, and whatnot, and just getting the same result.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a similar approach too with Rogue Angels when it comes to failure, right? Where
Mm,
you keep you have a
yeah,
branching path, right? So
yeah. So each mission is divided into mission segments. That's a way to both make sure that a mission is balanced throughout, and also to make sure I can control what happens within a mission. And because a mission in itself can also take a turn for the worse or for the better, depending on how you approach it. So it could start out as a stealth mission, and then suddenly you're gunning everyone down, and then of course that takes the mission in a different way. And I have a fail forward throughout all missions. The only mission is the introduction mission, just to have people repeat if they cannot complete the introduction. But other than that, you have the first mission segment can be restarted, and that's because I don't want it to make it unforgiving. And some people might read something wrong into a mission when they start. They might say, we should just take out those guys, and it turned out the other guys were more, dangerous, so on and so forth. But from there on, once you step into the next segment of a mission, the consequences stick. First of all, I don't like to redo, more than maybe a few, like 10 or 15 minutes of a game. I would not like to redo that. But secondly, there's nothing worse than redoing decisions, because it's the decision that sticks with you that is like, they don't feel as they don't have the same gravitas if you can redo the decisions. And most decisions will of course be done in the span of the mission. So if I've cut off some of it, so you can redo, but from there on you fail forward, then I reward players regardless with an experience.
hmm.
And them having the game acknowledge that you failed or you succeeded is part of that reward.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes sense. Uh, Another question, also from Brian here. So, while you see attachments to characters, what do you think about the possibilities of characters as a resource, where you can lose characters and the story campaign progresses forward? So, Emil, I think you've got that already planned in your game. So, you want to start?
Yeah, nah, that's yeah. I really don't like the idea of a character as a resource. It's a buff too. The players, if they get different characters. But depending on how they complete missions and how they treat those characters, they can die on the way. During a campaign. I will not expand upon that. And there is also relationships with some of the characters. So depending on who they are and where they come from and all that stuff. So there is a relationship aspect to balance with them if you are so interested. And therefore I see them as they are part of the story, and also some of the companions are voices for the players, because players cannot speak themselves in a game like this, in a board game where you try to be interactive, you cannot have the players speak into the game, so they can make choices. So in order to voice those choices and the consequences thereof, you have the companions to be sometimes the good or the bad guy, the voices on your shoulders, right, telling you what to do or what they would do. So that is a way to get around that in a narrative sense.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, Tyson. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember character elimination in you Phantom Epoch off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, there isn't character elimination.
Okay, that's why I don't remember. That's good. So...
I smirked when I saw the question in the chat because, again, this is just a me thing. But like, I play a game like XCOM where you're supposed to be using characters as a resource, and I try to use the same characters from start to finish. And when a character dies, it's a big deal to me. I hate it. So I really like Emil's answer, though, because character death definitely serves a purpose in narrative. I don't like the term character as a resource in that case, but like when a character dies in Rogue Angels, I'm imagining, this isn't a spoiler because I don't know, you're attached to that character, and it has an impact on you, and it's not just a resource that you just lost. It's something that you're attached to, and that I think definitely has a place.
Yeah, we've been playing we call it Marvel United crossover campaign on this channel. Generally every Mondays. It's me, my wife Kim, of course, and then we work with Derrick from Kanji Studios, and in that one we're playing this big campaign where there's you unlock characters and fight different bosses in the through Marvel United system. But that one, when you say characters as a resource, I feel like that would apply there because there we are unlocking characters and we're using characters to fight these bad guys, and if we lose, those characters are removed from the pool, right? Which is very different. There's no narration here. It's literally just making choices, unlocking stuff, and just seeing how, just experiencing the different combinations the game provides. So that is more, I think, and more of a direct comparison to what Brian's suggesting versus Rogue Angels and Phantom Epoch here.
Yeah, makes sense.
No, just jump in here. Sorry. Okay. Now, one thing that I was trying to figure this out myself is when we talk about campaign games, I feel like there's a level of expectations that come with that descriptor to games, right? And I'm curious about what your experiences have been from the design side when you describe Phantom Epoch or Rogue Angels, a campaign game. What type of response have you seen from people that they expect to see? What elements do they want to see? And what did you do to try to make sure you delivered on those expectations? I'll go ahead and start with you, Emil.
Yeah, I still have to deliver, so we'll see how that goes. But a big part of this, a big part of it, and the Kickstarter and everything else is the alignment of expectations, because people come with different backgrounds and different experiences from other games. So some will come and expect, a million miniatures here and there, and some will, expect a bazillion cards where you flip through and find a card you need for the next unlock, something. So there is a lot of that, and kind of get people zoned in on what exactly it is that I want to present to players. And I think a lot of it comes down to making sure you kind of present the essential parts up front, of course, but also make sure to present the gameplay and some of the, in this case when it's a campaign game, present some of the mortar in between the bricks. Like, what is it that combined, what is it that makes it a campaign game? Because people could also be just asking for an engine builder over several sessions, right?
Right.
So you have to explore and explain many of these aspects, which makes it often a hard sell, you could say, because campaign games is both more expensive than the average game, and also has a lot more commitment to it if you want to experience it. So it makes it tough to get around the entire experience and make sure people understand what they're going into.
Tyson, what are your thoughts on that topic there on meeting the expectations of what it means to be a campaign game?
Yeah, I might be shooting myself in the foot a little bit with this answer, but with Phantom Epoch, I can't say that I sought to meet expectations. I had my vision and I stuck to it with what I wanted to create. I think everybody, I'm looking forward to seeing what the chat says about this, but I think in general, everybody has different expectations for a campaign game. You're not going to please everyone, and you shouldn't try to please everyone.
Right,
right. You should stick to your vision. I'll mention one thing that kind of surprised me leading up to and into the Kickstarter with Phantom Epoch. And in hindsight, it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. And that's that bigger isn't better. So throughout the Kickstarter, one frequent comment I saw was that people were interested, but I was advertising over 40 missions, over 100 hours of gameplay. And in the genre, that's actually, I don't know, you could kind of say that's even kind of small compared to other games out there for sure. But when people saw that, I frequently got comments about, oh, that's too much. And I'm interested, but I have 10 other campaign games sitting on my shelf collecting dust because I can't get them to the table. So something that I should have done better with Phantom Epoch throughout the Kickstarter and setting expectations is that, yeah, that much gameplay is in there, but that's if you want to do that much. Like there's a lot of side content, there's branching story paths. And if you really want to, you just want the core experience and that's it, you can get through it in a much shorter amount of time than that. So yeah, I guess that's one expectation. And since the Kickstarter 2 years ago, I think that's even more true today as more and more campaign games come out, that people want an accessible experience that they can get to the table without committing to it being on the table for a year plus.
Yeah, for sure. That kind of it's going to dive into another topic or question I'm bringing up as well. But just to elaborate on that more, I feel like that's maybe the effect of Gloomhaven. I would say Gloomhaven was a big game, of course, in the community. Massive fantasy dungeon crawl type game, big old campaign, and I can't remember how many missions right in that thing. Just a ton, and people are like, yes, I want more, I want more. And when they actually got it, they're like, this is a lot. So how many people actually got through them all? So there's people who did, but it's when if there are so many games competing for your attention, right? And people want to play them through, but how much time do people actually have or will be able to commit to that? It makes it difficult, right, to get through that. And so I was actually one thing I know you guys haven't had your games released yet, but I'm curious from a design standpoint. You've gone through all this work putting together this game, and you send it out there, and maybe people only get through the first, like, let's say your whole game is 20 missions, right? And maybe they only get through 10 of it. Most people do. I'm curious how that would make you, like, what's your reaction to that? Like, is that your expectation? You're fine with that, or like, do you feel like those other 10 missions or are you bummed that people are experiencing those other 10 missions? I don't know. Have you guys thought about that some?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, it is what it is. Players do what they can with their time, and if they are so lucky that they have money and time to play games, which is a luxury in the world in itself, I mean, they should do what they think is the most fun to do with that time, right? And you can only be honored that they want to play for 10 missions, if that's the thing, or for 10 hours, or and of course I think it's important that if you have put in 20 missions, that and we all know that not everyone will get through to that, but you don't slack on the quality just because you know that some people will fall asleep half through a movie, right? You don't, okay, we can just dial down the CGI because we have, some people they sleep. So I think it's important to stay true to your vision and what you want to tell. If you do it in 20 missions or play sessions, then that's because that's what you think you need to tell the story, right? And some people will follow you to that end, and that's where the experience lie as a game designer. I think is to get that gratification of those people who complete your vision.
For sure. Tyson, you want to jump in? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, similar thoughts. I think the reality is that most people are not going to complete a campaign game from start to finish,
Mhm.
A long campaign game from start to finish. So I think it's important that each mission or scenario or whatever you want to call it, session, is an encapsulated experience
Mm.
that feeds into the overall story. So if somebody, like Emil said, if somebody goes from start to finish, that's gratifying. They get that conclusion. But if they only end up playing a few missions, they still have an experience. They've still experienced part of the world that you've created, and it's satisfying.
Mm-hmm. Brian has a really good question here. I want to pull up. Do you think a shorter campaign that focuses more on repeatability, say a New Game Plus, to see a true or full story? So basically, like, do you put together, instead of doing a long campaign with, like, let's say 20 missions, maybe you do a short campaign of 5 missions, but each time you play these 5 missions, they're going to be different enough to basically equate to that 20 mission experience. How do you feel about those approaches? Or what the pros and cons between that?
They are definitely different experiences, because you just change almost the premise of the medium that you're using, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing is, what is replayability and what is variety? It's also very different from you could say something like, taking another example would be StarCraft. Like it has infinite playability because people keep developing new strategies for that game, right? So, but the variety is what it is now, right? It's kind of set in stone. So it all depends on the implementation of the variety that you bring in. A new starting position is not variety. That's not anything. Like, you could look at decisions as if they only go skin deep, like one level deep, then they're not interesting decisions to make. Like, you need something more, and the same goes for a story or something where you put in sequences of play. So I think if you do a 5 sequence play, then you have to focus on other elements than just the narrative, because that in itself, I think, will have a hard time being the payoff every time you play it. Then
Mm-hmm.
there needs to be other elements to it. Um, that's my thought. Personally.
Yeah, I think for me personally, and this is just a personal thing, I almost never replay games just because of time commitment. So I like the concept if somebody's really loving a game with a shorter campaign and they want more and they can do a new game plus and get more variety by doing so. That's a good concept. Me personally, I would never do it just because there's so many different games competing for table space. If I get through one, I'm going to move on to the next, realistically.
Sure.
So me personally, I would rather within that first campaign that I'm playing be able to branch off into different things if I want to explore more, rather than kind of start over to get that more content.
Yep. That leads into something I want to explore with the two of you, coming from the content creation, like the creating media, for example, and reviewing games, or previewing games, I would say. Um, how we get, there's a lot of prototypes coming in, and we see a portion of it, right? And then if we back the game or get the game, review a copy, where it happens to be, from a content creation standpoint, play the game, and from a reviewer, I'm not sure how far they would play the game before they review it. I know back in the day, I was very I set myself a goal to, like, hey, I want to get through the campaign before I review it. But then it took so long for the reviews to come out, that I got feedback like, hey, I want to see, this is good information, but I want to have it sooner, right? And so now I'm trying to find a medium that, like, hey, I'll try to review it after I see the major elements of the campaign without maybe going through the full campaign experience. Um, how do you guys feel about the expectations of content creation from seeing the all the elements of campaign game and being able to provide that information as a service to the community?
Yeah, so I think you guys have a really tough job with campaign games, a really hard job, because you can't play every campaign game from start to
Right,
finish
right.
to review it. And a campaign game at the beginning is generally going to be very different than that same campaign game at the end. But when you start the campaign and play a couple of scenarios of it, that's enough to form an opinion of if you would want to keep going with that. And when you give that feedback to your viewers, your followers, that helps them form their opinion of if, oh, this is something I would want to play for more than a couple scenarios. I think too that it's important for publishers and designers to let content creators know what the big twists, not necessarily twists, but how the game evolves as you go through, so that you can probably convey that. And we were talking before the stream started that I think, and a prototype is a different story, but I think I did a terrible job of that when I sent you that little prototype. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I think that you probably had no idea what the full Phantom Epoch game looked like until you saw that unboxing video a couple weeks ago. Like what I sent you was not representative of the whole, and I did a terrible job conveying what the whole was. And I think that's on designers and publishers as well, to make sure that reviewers have that information.
Yeah, I think as part of it's definitely true. I didn't expect Phantom Epoch to be as large as it is, right? Um, but I think what helped a lot when it came to prototype is you included. So let's get a little bit of Phantom Epoch's design. You have a character, and at some point, your character class or your skill, like the healer, for example, can split off into one of two paths. And those cards were included in there, even though it wasn't necessarily obvious at the time how that happens through the campaign, but I could still see the elements were there. So I understood that this was something that was going to be coming for all the classes and something's going to come down the line, right? So for the prototype side, I think prototypes, in my opinion, should be just like really small, one, maybe two missions, right? Just to give a taste of the game. But if you include, at least from my standpoint, elements that will be present later on without necessarily having the connection, at least that provides like context, right? And then you can extrapolate from there to kind of provide that information to viewers. So I think there's probably like a happy medium in there, right? At some point. And then from my standpoint, I know this is not a popular approach, but using digital medium like tabletop simulator, for example, to share those prototypes, I find is really convenient, from the like someone running a YouTube channel and a designer's perspective, because those it's always updated, right? Sometimes we send out these prototypes, things change, and then like, oh wait, hold on, we changed this one rule, and that gets shared, no big deal. We can work with that. But the nice thing about digital is it's always up to date, right? But the community as a whole wants to see that physical product. It wants to see it on the table because that is how they're going to experience it. I totally understand that from that side. So it's a little bit of like do we approach it from like what is the true experience, and like you also miss some things in the tabletop side, where like set up, tear down, and how to organize things that also comes in play part of the experience. So yeah, it's a tough one, right? You want to provide a
Mhm.
distilled, focused prototype, but still kind of capture all the elements of the game. It's a tough one. I have seen some people, actually, Emil, you actually, I'll call it you for doing this. Where you sent out a prototype with a different combination of characters for each
Hmm.
reviewer.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really cool, because that way you can go to different channels, see different experiences, and see more of the full breadth of the game without having a ton of stuff in one box. Want to elaborate on that a little
Mm.
bit?
Yeah, that was primarily an economical perspective, but it was I had a spreadsheet, so to speak, where I had the different characters, and I was kind of lining them up and saying, okay, I need one who's a strong hacker and a strong shooter and stuff, and then in that way, I kind of made sure that every reviewer got a set of the diversity that was within the character's skill set. So it was, of course, very elaborate in that sense. But when it comes to prototypes of campaign games, it's very much a financial aspect of,
Yeah.
because it's so huge. And when you have things that like booklets or stuff or something where you alter things, write on it or whatever, it becomes a very expensive prototype quickly. So, and I think like you also talk about, like, from a content creator perspective, you are both reviewing a book and a game at the same time, and you have to give a sense of, like, how does it feel on the storytelling side, the world building, and how does it mesh together, and also include all the comments about the mechanics and how they kind of unravel with new upgrades and whatnot, right? So it's yeah, I don't envy you. No.
Tim has a good question here brought up. What about custom missions for content creators that shows everything versus playing the real game missions? Which I think is, I have seen something like this from at conventions, where you go to a convention and they've created a unique scenario just for demoing the game in a short period of time, kind of covering everything. But it's not meant to be an actual scenario or setup in the actual game itself, right? Yeah.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on that?
It- it's it's definitely plausible to do, and it could be a viable way. It's also dangerous because you're overselling something at a, because people just get a glimpse of it and they think, oh, I just get everything.
Yeah.
So it's easier to do in a computer game, right? You start out at this huge barbarian something something, and you slash everything for the first mission, and then you figure out, oh, I'm playing as the sun in the next mission, and that's who I'm building up to be this cool epic. But you kind of got the whole idea to begin with, hook and then sinker, and then you're off to the campaign, right? And I mean that could be done in an elegant way in a board game too. I'm sure.
For sure, for sure.
I think for me, something that I'm terrible at marketing, absolutely terrible at marketing. And something that I struggled with a lot going into the Kickstarter, and the people that helped me with marketing kept hammering away at me about it. I wanted to keep things secret. I wanted to keep a lot of things secret. And as a first time indie creator, that's really hard to do because you haven't built up the trust in the community to allow yourself to keep a secret, and people trust that there's stuff in there that's going to be good. You need to actually show it.
Right.
Um, so that got me thinking about this question. Like, yes, that's a good idea to show everything. Me personally, and again, I'm terrible at marketing. I want to keep things a secret from people that are looking at the game, like some of the upgrades and whatnot. I don't want them to see that ahead of actually getting those themselves, which again makes your job even tougher, Steve.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can kind of see some of the hints in the prototypes without seeing the actual result of it. But like you said, it's just don't know. And actually, that drives into a little bit of the I don't want to get into too much of this, but Kickstarter, GameFound, whatever crowdfunding site you use in general, where you have these stretch goals, right? And the stretch goals are maybe hidden, right? You reveal them at some point because you've got them in your back pocket. But then people come to the page on the first day or two, right? And they see the price of it and see what the game is, but that's not necessarily the whole game because as the campaign goes on, you reveal stretch goals and there's more to the game, right? So it's a kind of a little bit double-edged sword where like you want that excitement, you want people to join, or you might even need the funding to support that stuff, but you also want to when people join for the first time looking at the page, you want to provide them that value proposition. Um, what are you guys' thoughts on,
Mm.
on that approach that is very common in our industry? So
Mm. Yeah, but it is, as Tyson said, that it is very hard to do as an indie. So it's much easier when you know you have a certain amount of backing and you know you have a certain amount of customers to go to begin with, or if you have a reputation of doing something epic in general. So it's and I think it's and that's a whole nother discussion about the viability of that approach because it takes some of the trust out if you keep if you keep things secret in terms of marketing and all this with the price point of a product. If you keep some of the stretch goals secret but they're actually part of the game but you're just expecting to reach them and all that, it makes it very blurry and not so transparent. So there are I mean, as an indie, I think transparency and openness about how you're funding and how your funds is being used in the game and how big the game is from the get-go. And I went with a one version, one vision kind of approach. And I didn't want anything else, both because I know from a logistical perspective it will be a nightmare, but also because I want people so there should not be an A and a B side of, or a winner and a almost winner backer, right? They
sure,
should all get the experience that I want to tell and that I want them to have. So
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Let me. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tyson? Before we move on.
Uh, Ditto.
Ditto. Fair enough.
Ditto, well.
I want a little more contentious question. I would say. What are some of the downfalls you see in campaign game designs today? Is there anything that you, as you approach your campaign game, you wanted to avoid?
There is one thing for campaign games, and yeah, I think for in general when games turn to a certain complexity, and that's often that comes with campaign games. Many games and game designers, ergo, they take players' time for granted. And that might be controversial to say, but I think when I read some of the rule books for some of the big games, I'm like, you're just expecting people to know all this stuff, right? You're just expecting people to go from A to B and then have a good time. And we all know that it's very hard to read 50 pages of manual and how to refer to them afterwards, and all this setup and tear down of a campaign game. Like when I look at, and that's often on the discourse and Facebook groups and all that stuff, right? And you see, oh, this is a great game. You just need to keep it on the table because you cannot pack it away. And I'm like, that's a huge thing to put on a player or a customer, that they should just have the room to have the whole thing unpacked. Then it's a good game. I mean, and it can be, and there are many great games that takes an hour to unpack. But that's, yeah, I'm not a fan of it.
As someone who has a smaller gaming table, Kim's probably watching. Is like, no, of course you bring that up. So it is sometimes difficult to even cover a game if it takes up a lot of space, right? Because how do I how do I bring all these elements in? How am I able to present it in a clear and easy to follow fashion when it's covers a wide expanse? So it can be very challenging for sure. Tyson, your thoughts?
Yeah, similar. I mean, I'll preface this by saying, as embarrassing as it is, I'm behind the times on campaign games. Since starting designing Phantom Epoch, it's taken most of my gaming time, so I haven't played a lot of the newer campaign games, honestly. At least not enough to really give a full opinion on them. But absolutely, accessibility is huge, given just how many games there are out there competing for table space. And for me, when I play a campaign game, like Emil said, if I'm spending half an hour putting it out on my table, it's staying on my table for at least a month. I hate the setup and tear down. So I mean, just a plug for, and I'm pretty sure Rogue Angels is the same way, but a plug for Black Magic Inserts, who did the inserts for Phantom Epoch. They did an absolutely fantastic job where you can set up and tear down the game in 5 minutes, and it's saved. The state is saved. So yeah,
Nice.
that's 100% on Black Magic, not on me. They're just
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I felt like that was something that, as I was watching other review formats, wasn't always covered enough. Or never highlighted quite as much. So when I did my review, I always made sure setup and cleanup was one of the elements I rated on, because that is, if a game takes 5 minutes to set up versus 30 minutes to set up, that is going to impact how often it would see the game table, honestly. Like, if people come over, hey, you want to play a game? Sure, why not? Like, no, if like, hold on, let's pause for 30 minutes before while I set this up, versus, oh yeah, let's put those on the table real quick and just play a quick game, right? It's very different approaches from that standpoint. So, yeah, great.
That also speaks into this thing about relearning a game, right?
Mm.
Like you often look at all your games, right? And you pick the ones where you're like, yeah, I can remember the rules. And as soon as you go into, I will have to read a lot of the rules again in order to, sit down and enjoy it, then it stays on the shelf for longer than it has to. And there are many great games where that happens, right? Because you almost get scared of, like, you have to sit and read 20 of the 50 pages again to get a hold of, like, how was it with this? And there was this magical element where you're like, and you're spending them along, and then there was this cleanup phase here, and you also have to go and buy somewhere something, and it builds up and builds up, right? So as yeah, and it's not that those elements should not be there, but you need to make the rules as accessible as possible, but also as clean, and hopefully draw on um, similar, or like known concepts, and not like everything break the mold, because then it's very tough when you play alongside other games, right? You have other games you enjoy, right? And if they have a similar approach, it will be easier to get them on. So not it's good to break the mold, just not on every front.
I feel like a line of sight is like a really good example of that, right? There's every time I pull up a game, I'm like, okay, what's the line of sight in this game versus this other game, right? But something that's been more common is like a deck builder. I feel like the 5 card hand size is very common across deck builders. Not all of them, of course, and it can vary, no big deal. But like that's like the one main thing I have to look up when I'm grabbing an older game off the shelf is what's the hand size. So,
Yeah.
good. Um, okay, let's talk about your experiences specifically on designing Rogue Angels and Phantom Epoch. What was the most difficult aspect when you approached the design of each of your games?
So for me, since we're talking about design, I'll try and stick to that. The publishing side has been a lot more difficult for me than the design side, but today we're talking about design. So for me, I think in a way, playtesting and receiving feedback. I historically have 2 qualities that are super detrimental to that. First is I'm a people pleaser, and if I'm being honest, second is I'm historically fairly thin-skinned, and those do not work well with playtesting. So what was difficult for me, like the first time I got Phantom Epoch in front of strangers' eyes, that was a terrifying experience for me. And I was fortunate in that for the first playtest, the first group of playtest strangers that I brought in, the feedback was pretty much universally positive. So that kind of got me over the hump. But of course, as you bring in more playtesters and get it in front of more eyes, not everyone's going to love it. And some people are going to even hate it. And they're not going to be afraid to tell you so.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I've been super lucky in both the number and quality of playtesters that I've gotten that have stuck with Phantom Epoch from like the roughest stages, and kept playtesting. And some of them, excuse me, some of them honestly didn't like Phantom Epoch, and they weren't afraid to tell me so. And at first, that was difficult to hear. But that's some of the most valuable feedback that you can get. And for whatever reason, those playtesters, some of them, even though they didn't love Phantom Epoch, it wasn't their cup of tea, they kept coming back week after week to keep playtesting and giving me feedback. And uh, I mean, I'm just so thankful for that. I've gotten really lucky with my playtesters, and Phantom Epoch wouldn't be what it was without them. So just a shout out to all of you guys if you're listening.
Nice.
Emil, what do you got?
Yeah. Oh, I would definitely echo Tyson's approach on like the publishing, manufacturing part, and all this is there are more difficult elements there, and probably because they're not as enjoyable as game designing in general. Um, I wouldn't say like everything is possible and it can be done. Like for me, the hardest part has been the campaign itself, and the thing that you actually need your characters to speak to you as if you were a author. Like, I mean, 1,000 pages, and you need some author blood, right? And I've got tremendous help from my co-writer Lisa, and I mean, it's just such a long process, and I think it's the hardest part is you have to force it a little bit. You cannot wait for everything to just come to you.
Mm.
So there's a lot of managing the and keep progression on the design and on the production side, getting everything from illustrations and everything from the programming that I use to compile my campaign books, all that stuff. I wouldn't say any of it is particularly difficult, but it's the sum of it that makes it, a huge undertaking. And especially when you have to balance family and have to balance everything else. So it's more the entrepreneur side of everything that becomes the hardest part. In the designing is usually the fun or the most fun, even if sometimes it comes down to like getting a lot of corrections.
Mm-hmm.
Like I mean, I've corrected on those campaign books, I don't know, like 3 or 4 thousand corrections, like just minor things, a comma here and
Mm-hmm.
I there instead of me, and all these kind of things. It's a lot of work. Um, yeah,
For sure. Yeah,
that's it.
I dives into more of the playtesting thing. I know we're getting a little over time here, so I'm going to wrap a few more questions probably ended. Sure we can have more of a discussion in the future. But Strumrick has a question on here, and I think it's going to tie into a little bit what I want to dive into a little bit more too. Do you survey playtesters prior to them playing to see their expectations? This way you can gauge their feedback against that. I know from my personal experience, when I've playtested games, there has been any or very little, I'd say. Well, sorry, let me rephrase that. Smaller publishers or smaller indie games, I haven't been surveyed for that. For the bigger ones, I have. Like they'll
Hmm.
try to get different groups there. What have your experiences have been when it comes to playtesters?
I mean, I think it goes with almost with the marketing, how you sell the game. Those people will be the ones approaching and accepting a playtest session. So I think it's kind of adjusting itself, you could
Mhm.
say. Um, yeah, and I think it can be good when you have a dialogue with the playtesters and kind of figure out where they're coming from and what they want. And there's definitely a thing to remember: if they are game designers themselves, they're often looking at trying to fix your problem and not just giving feedback. So there are some
Yeah.
ways you have to understand where they come from in order to know what you should take from it. Because sometimes you get a resource management designer who's like, "Oh, you should just have more dice." And like, yeah, but that's not how this game is supposed to work. So it's noted, but I'm probably not going to change that. So yeah.
Yeah, for me, the very first ads that I ran for Phantom Epoch were to get playtesters. So I didn't go what I think is probably the usual route of joining playtesting groups with mostly designers playtesting each other's stuff, which is super valuable, of course. But the first route that I went was just ads to get playtesters sign up. So I ended up with a fairly sizable list, and yeah, there was a survey on the sign up, just really basic questions. Um, so yeah, there was a survey first. So I knew what I was getting into, and if I didn't always choose playtesters from that list that sounded like they would love Phantom Epoch. I would choose ones that sounded like they maybe wouldn't love Phantom Epoch. And I should add too, like to Emil's point, that part of my inherent people-pleasing attitude that's so bad is you're not going to please everyone.
Yeah.
And you really have to learn what feedback enhances your vision and your passion for your game versus what changes that vision. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it's really important to know like your intended audience and try to like make sure you focus on delivering to that audience, because if you try to focus on, I mean, ideally everyone should love this game, right? That's what everyone wants, but that's the reality situation is each game is going to have a different audience that's going to like it, and make sure that audience has the best possible experience, I think, is a healthy approach. So Dan has a question, interesting one. Says, "Have you had a playtester say, 'I didn't win. I don't like your game'?"
I don't think I've personally had that. I know that when I'm watching playtest sessions, especially at first, that I would really be rooting for the players and hoping that they would squeak out a win when things weren't looking good. And I would have to fight with my own tendency to kind of steer them in the right direction
Mm-hmm.
so that they would win. Um, but I like it's very valuable to have playtesters fail missions. Like that's super important. Um, and I don't think that I've ever had a playtester say, I don't like the game because I failed that mission. Sometimes they would say, I don't want to do that mission again, and that's fair enough. And
Sure.
that is, maybe there's things to tweak about that mission to make it more enjoyable, that they might want to play it again and get over that hump and beat it. But to say that they don't like the game because they didn't win, I don't think I've personally experienced that.
No, I think no, but it does come with regular gaming, or you sit down with a game, and your experience will be colored by whether or not you won or lost. But I think for a cooperative game, it's a little bit different. Because the competitive side, there will always be, this like, did somebody know a bit more about it? Are they more into math? Blah blah blah. All these kind of explanations and tension creating um, explanations to that. But for a cooperative game, I think people deal with losses better because it's like something they've done together. And again, if a game can reward it in some sense, like acknowledging that they lost and therefore they get a different outcome. And it's not necessarily just, well, you just start here again. There's a starting setup. You go. Then I think they will also be more lenient towards the experience.
Mike, you got a really good question here. So, Mike's other question about input and output randomness. I think I want to table that for another one because I think that's going to be a longer discussion. Like I said, I want to have these guys come on in the future, but I think I want to wrap this up because I know we're over time a little bit here with one last question about playtesting a bit. So, we talk about playtesters, but we're also talking about campaign games, and there's a lot of perceptions on I'm buying campaign game. I know the first 2, 3, 4 scenarios, missions, whatever it has to be, are going to be really great because they're playtested a lot, and the last missions are going to be the worst because they're not playtested a lot. That's a assumption that may or may not be true, and I'm curious what your guys' experience is approaching that and trying to mitigate that expectation.
I mean, it will always be true. Like things that has been looked upon like 200 times will be more, adjusted, more detailed than things that have been looked on maybe 10 or 20 times. That's a fact of life. But when it comes to playtesting such, and I know it depends on how your progression system works in the game. What I did was that I quickly separated game mechanics and story progression. And like, do the story work as it should? Like, does it have a story arc? Does it have the three chapters, or the point of no return and all that stuff, right? And the climax and all that stuff. And then the game mechanics. And the game mechanics I could refine by playtesting like with people. And the other thing, I could meta playtest by pretending or just reading through, right? So you could, and I've had several people who do that for me, luckily, and also some that playtest every single mission. Even that's not the point, right? But they read through the story. So does it work from then that's playtesting of the story, right? Like, does it work from a story perspective, going from A to B? And then you can work on the mechanics, and it depends on how much they intertwine, but you have to make some averages, and I've done that on some schematics because everything is Excel in my world. But where I put down, okay, when you are in chapter 4, then you have X amount of this and X amount of that and this and that. And then I've set up and been like, okay, if you want to play test here, you should have a character that is at this strength on average. And when I design missions, I also do average estimations on how far people can walk and shoot and all that stuff. And yeah, so it's about separating those elements and then kind of distilling them down to the fundamentals of the values of a character, and of course the story progression and all that.
I know Tyson, you mentioned earlier how it was a big thing for you wanting to keep things hidden or surprise for players too. Was that an extra challenge trying to get the earlier versus later scenarios play tested?
So again, I've been super fortunate with the playtesters that playtest Phantom Epoch. So I mean, testing in general is near and dear to my heart. Software automation testing is my background. So when starting Phantom Epoch, like from the very start, I was testing and bringing in people to help test it from the very roughest stages. So like Emil said, separating mechanics from the narrative is important. And I spent probably a year plus testing with playtesters, just the first couple of missions and getting the mechanics nailed down. But then again, I've been really fortunate in the playtesters that came on with Phantom Epoch that leading up to the Kickstarter and until very, very recently, I had play tests running on a daily basis, sometimes twice daily, with different groups going through the campaign. So not anything in particular that I did, but just the play testers that I looked into. I got lots of full end-to-end campaign playthroughs, which is important. And of course, sometimes there's missions later on and features later on that you want to test on an individual basis, and you set that up. But seeing how it fits into the full campaign progression is super important. And again, nothing that I did, just thanks to the playtesters. Yeah, just constant end-to-end playthroughs for years.
Cool.
Hmm.
Awesome. Well, I think we could probably talk about this for another couple hours, honestly. So, but I think, like I said, I want to bring both of you guys back on a future time. So we'll probably break it here for now. And the community, if you guys have
Awesome.
questions that you want to hear from designers and stuff, put them in the video YouTube comments below, and I'll gather those up for next time so we can address anything you guys have. So, and I took a few notes too, as well as some of the other topics came up. So I have fun digging into
Awesome.
this stuff with you guys. But I want to thank you guys so much for your time. So thank you, Emil and Tyson, for jumping on. It was a blast chatting
Thank
with you
you.
guys.
It was
so much.
indeed. Thank you.
Awesome.
So,
And then I want to make sure people know where to find your game, where to find you guys. I'll start with you, Tyson. How can people get in touch with you or find your game?
Yep, so com is the easiest way. We still have late pledges or hosted pre-orders on BackerKit, the different terminology on the different systems. We're going to have pre-orders open there for maybe a month more, maybe a little bit less before we start, before the boxes hit the ocean.
nice.
Yeah, so yeah.
It's exciting. It's very soon.
Yeah.
Been a long time coming.
It has been.
Nice.
What about you, Emil? Where people can find you?
Yeah, if they search on Rogue Angels and either Kickstarter or GameFound, I'm pretty sure they will find the game. So I will trust that those who want to find it, they can, definitely. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Well, yeah, I'll end it here for this video. And for this channel, we'll be back Monday. We're probably going to have 2 videos on Monday. One can be the Marvel United campaign I mentioned earlier. And then I've got a collaboration with Paul from Dads and Dice we'll be doing. So join us Monday for more content. But again, thank you guys so much for joining. And we'll see you next time at the Guild. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.